Here I am, walking in the park to do some Kusarigama training, all perfectly normal. Now that is the shadow of a live, razor-sharp blade, but I am using my very safe training weight, and keep that in mind. Because the point of this video, in addition to me starting to get back to training with this thing, is how visually difficult to track this weapon is. A perhaps overlooked advantage that it has. Not that it doesn't have plenty of disadvantages, but you saw that nice bright white sock that I put over the nice safe training weight. And granted, this is at a distance as I warm up here, but notice how difficult it is to track. And yes, especially against the background where I am. If I was standing out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by, just if there was only a blue sky behind me, it'd be easier. You're looking at a couple of blurry movie stills recreating one of Miyamoto Musashi's most famous duels, and it was against a Kusarigama master, Shishido Baiken, best I can do, and yeah, they fought outdoors. One of the other famous Kusarigama versus sword duels in Japan's history was in a bamboo grove. And so this is a realistic backdrop, the kind you would have to contend with as your opponent swings that weight, tries to trick you, like with this forward flick that I'm using. Right, that's a traditional technique. You think the weight is going to travel along its elliptical path, and then you kind of flick it out like a towel instead. And of course I can move around, I don't have to stand in one place, so I'm moving along different vectors now, right? Forwards, backwards, and with the weight in constant motion. And remember, this is a bright white sock. Imagine a little black weight. And that's not even close to being the end of the list on difficulties in tracking. For instance, we also have range. If you have a sword blade that is 3 feet long, it's only 3 feet long. Like, that doesn't change. But for instance, right now, this is kind of a 6-foot-long weapon. And you can switch mid-fight, mid-motion from one to the other. Watch this transition here. When you actually break that down, you're talking about a 6-foot-long weapon being wielded in the right hand on the horizontal plane, instantly changing to, say, a 4-foot weapon in the left hand being spun in the vertical plane. And all the while, there's a completely different threat in my right hand, the kama, the sickle. And this might be the only weapon in world history we could say all of those things about. Other long, fully flexible weapons, a bullwhip, a meteor hammer, manriki gusari, western flails of various sorts. That actually doesn't apply to any of them. Notice here, after this big strike, I have to do a 360 with my whole body in order to keep the weapon spinning. That kind of thing being part of the price you pay with a fully flexible weapon. You have to maintain that momentum unless you've actually struck home. And as long as we're touching on the downside, what if you have to turn around? I mean, you might have to face completely behind you while maintaining that momentum. And that was that. That was done in the middle of keeping the helicopter swing type going. But what if you're doing a figure 8 and have to turn 90 degrees? That's how you would do that. Now, back to the point of the video, the visual challenge of fighting someone who's using one of these. Notice here, I don't have to keep swinging in a predictable figure 8 pattern. Anytime I want, I can turn one into a helicopter spin that then stays on one side longer than expected, and then lash out whenever I want. Look how far the weight is from my body in this sequence, and then think about how we instinctually want to focus on our enemy, on their body during a fight. One of my favorite things is how smoothly and subtly you can change the range. We've shown a little bit of that, but watch this in the next sequence. Only from a distance profile view is it obvious that you kind of quickly went from a mid-range weapon to a fairly long-range one. Right there. And that's really cool because you're closing the gap without taking a step forward. Moving forward is the normal way to do that. Your opponent understands that intuitively. They don't expect to go from out of your range to in your range without seeing your feet move, as demonstrated here, the more, again, typical way. And it's also very easy with just a subtle movement and wrist English to add to the speed of the weapon. Just becomes a blur. And one of the problems though with this kind of weapon is exactly that. I hit myself. And that's why we're using the training weight. But reminder, I have a live razor sharp blade in hand. And since it's kind of a hooked one, yeah, that's another downside is I could of course cut myself, especially with all that arm motion going on. A bigger danger is accidentally hooking the chain, which does happen. as you're learning, and that could inadvertently send the weight flying onto you. And you don't want that, because that little hard to see and hard to track weight carries a tremendous amount of power in a full swing. And that's the conundrum for the opponent. All it takes is one mistake on their part. And if you notice, it just didn't break that cinder block, it kind of went through it like a bullet. And keep that in mind when you think about dueling someone who's got one of these spinning in ever-shifting patterns, ever-shifting lengths. That is the video. Further training with and thoughts on the Kusarigama, focusing on its stealthy nature, which does not seem to make it into discussions about the weapon. Thanks for watching.